On the morning of December 5th, 1952, Londoners woke to find their city had vanished. Not destroyed, not evacuated, simply gone, swallowed by a thick yellow fog that turned noon into midnight. Visibility dropped to less than a foot. People couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. In just 5 days, this fog would kill more people than any single bombing raid during World War II. Drivers abandoned their cars in the middle of streets, unable to navigate even with headlights on full beam. Pedestrians groped along walls like blind men, handkerchiefs pressed to their mouths, choking on air that tasted of sulfur and metal. Inside homes, the fog seeped through closed windows and doors, filling living rooms with a greasy, acrid haze. It stained curtains yellow, left black residue on furniture. Outdoor concerts were canceled because musicians couldn't see their instruments. A performance at Sadler S. Wells Theater was halted mid-show when the audience could no longer see the stage through the thick smog that had infiltrated the building. But the worst part wasn't the darkness or the disruption. It was the silence that followed. The silence of people who went to bed coughing and simply never woke up. The silence of hospital wards overwhelmed with patients gasping for air that wouldn't come. The silence of a city realizing too late that the very air they breathed had become poison. It wasn't a natural disaster. This wasn't an act of God or an enemy attack. This was something far more disturbing. This was progress turned toxic, industrialization turned deadly, and a society's willingness to accept pollution as the price of prosperity finally presenting its bill. For 5 days in December 1952, London became a gas chamber, and 12,000 people paid with their lives for a lesson the world desperately needed to learn. This is the story of the Great Smog, the environmental disaster that changed everything. To understand how London became a death trap, we must first understand what London had become by 1952. This was not the gleaming modern city you might imagine. This was a London still scarred by war, still rebuilding from the devastation of the Blitz, still covered in the soot and ash of a century of industrial dominance. London in 1952 was the beating heart of an empire in decline, a city of nearly 9 million people crammed into a landscape of Victorian terraced houses, Gothic railway stations, and smoking factory chimneys. It was a city that ran on coal. Everything in London burned coal. The power stations that lit the streets burned coal. The factories that employed hundreds of thousands burned coal. The trains that connected the sprawling metropolis burned coal. And most critically, every single home, from the grandest townhouse in Mayfair to the humblest flat in the East End, burned coal for heat and cooking. Britain was a coal nation. It had been since the Industrial Revolution. Coal was British identity, British power, British prosperity. The country sat on vast reserves of the stuff, and for over a century, burning it had made Britain the workshop of the world. By 1952, Britain was burning approximately 200 million tons of coal annually. London alone consumed millions of tons each winter. But there was a problem. Britain's economy was shattered by the war. The country was broke. Rationing was still in effect 7 years after victory, and Britain desperately needed hard currency. So the government made a fateful decision. They would export the high-quality coal, the clean-burning anthracite, to earn foreign exchange. British citizens, British homes, would have to make do with the cheap stuff, the low-grade sulfur-rich coal that produced far more smoke and pollution when burned. Every evening as winter approached, millions of Londoners would shovel this dirty coal into their fireplaces and stoves. The smoke from millions of individual chimneys combined with the emissions from power stations, factories, and vehicles to create a permanent haze over the city. Londoners called these winter fogs pea soupers because of their thick yellow-green color. They were a regular feature of life, romanticized in Sherlock Holmes stories and Victorian literature, portrayed as mysterious and quintessentially British. But these weren't natural fogs. They were smogs, a portmanteau of smoke and fog coined decades earlier to describe the toxic mix of water vapor and pollution that regularly blanketed industrial cities. London had experienced killer smogs before. In 1873, a fog killed an estimated 700 people. In 1880, another killed over 1,000. But these deaths were accepted as unfortunate side effects of modern urban life. The Victorian attitude was simple. Where there's muck, there's brass. Pollution meant prosperity. Smoke meant jobs. And a few deaths were the price of progress. By 1952, this attitude had barely changed. London was perhaps the most polluted major city in the world. On an average winter day, the air contained concentrations of sulfur dioxide and particulate matter that would be considered catastrophically dangerous by modern standards. But to Londoners, this was just how cities smelled, how they looked. The alternative, clean air, would mean shutting down the economy, and post-war Britain simply couldn't afford that. The stage was set. A city of millions, all burning the dirtiest fuel available, in homes designed for coal fires, in a river valley prone to atmospheric traps, in the depths of winter. What happened next would force Britain to admit something terrifying. The enemy wasn't outside, it was in the air they breathed. The meteorological phenomenon that killed thousands of Londoners is called a temperature inversion, and understanding it is crucial to understanding what happened. Normally, air temperature decreases as altitude increases. Warm air at ground level rises, carrying pollutants up and away, dispersing them into the atmosphere. This is why smoke from a chimney rises and dissipates. But during a temperature inversion, a layer of warm air sits on top of cold air at ground level. It's acting like a lid on a pot, trapping everything beneath it. London sits in the Thames Valley, a natural basin surrounded by hills. It's the perfect geography for inversions. On December 5, 1952, an anticyclone, a high-pressure weather system, settled over London, bringing cold, still air. The lack of wind meant there was nothing to disperse the pollution. The cold air at ground level was trapped by warmer air above, and because it was December, because it was freezing, every person in London lit their coal fires. Every factory fired up its furnaces. Every power station burned at maximum capacity to meet demand. The smoke and sulfur dioxide from millions of sources began to accumulate in the cold air trapped at ground level. The moisture in the air condensed around the smoke particles, creating a thick, toxic fog. By the morning of December 5th, visibility had dropped dramatically. But this was London. Fog was normal. People went about their business. By the afternoon, the fog had become something unprecedented. It was thick, choking, and yellow. The acrid smell of sulfur dioxide burned throats and lungs. People began to struggle to breathe, but the British are nothing if not stoic. The buses kept running, though conductors had to walk in front with lanterns to guide drivers. People went to work, went shopping, went to the pub. Life, as the saying goes, must go on. But the fog kept getting worse. By December 6th, it was impossible to see more than a few feet. Traffic ground to a halt. Ambulances couldn't reach patients because drivers couldn't see the roads. The River Thames, normally bustling with shipping, fell silent as boats were unable to navigate. At Smithfield Market, the great meat market of London, prize cattle due to be shown suffocated in their stalls, dying from the poisoned air. The London Underground became a refuge. Thousands descended into the tube stations, the only places where the air was relatively clear, though even there the fog had begun to seep in. Concerts and films scheduled in underground venues went ahead because they were the only entertainment venues still accessible. Above ground, the city was dying. The first victims were the most vulnerable, those with pre-existing respiratory conditions, the elderly, the very young. But as the smog persisted, even healthy adults began to fall ill. Hospital emergency rooms were overwhelmed with people struggling to breathe. Their lips blew from oxygen deprivation, coughing up black mucus filled with the soot they had inhaled. Microstory 1, Personal Touch. A young nurse named Rosemary Slade later described the horror of those days. She watched patients arrive every few minutes, their faces turning darker shades of blue as their lungs failed. Some were children, carried in by panicked parents. Others were elderly couples who had survived the Blitz only to be killed by their own city's air. She worked 8-hour shifts, watching person after person drown in their own fluids, powerless to save them. The smell, she said, never left her. Coal smoke, death, and desperation. Doctors, trained in an era before modern environmental medicine, were baffled. They had no framework for understanding mass poisoning by air pollution. They treated symptoms, pneumonia, bronchitis, heart failure, but they didn't understand the cause. Many didn't even make the connection between the fog and the sudden spike in deaths. After all, fog was normal. How could weather kill thousands? But Londoners didn't know it yet. Every breath was a chemical experiment happening inside their lungs, and the results were lethal. The smog was a complex chemical weapon, though no enemy had deployed it. The main components were sulfur dioxide, produced when the sulfur in coal burns, in particulate matter, the tiny solid particles of soot and ash. When sulfur dioxide combines with water vapor in the air, it forms sulfuric acid. Londoners were essentially breathing a dilute acid mist that corroded their lungs with every breath. The particulate matter was equally deadly. These microscopic particles, some small enough to penetrate deep into the lungs and even enter the bloodstream, carried toxic metals and chemicals absorbed from the coal smoke. They caused inflammation, blocked airways, and provided surfaces for bacteria to thrive, leading to massive waves of secondary infections. But there was something else in that fog, something doctors in 1952 couldn't even measure. Carbon monoxide, the silent killer. Produced by incomplete combustion of coal, this odorless, colorless gas was accumulating in homes and streets. People went to sleep with their coal fires burning and simply never woke up. Their families found them in the morning looking peaceful, as if they'd died in their sleep. In a sense, they had. Carbon monoxide had shut down their brains while they dreamed. The smog didn't kill instantly like a bomb. It was a slow suffocation, a gradual poisoning. People would feel fine, then develop a cough, then struggle to breathe, then collapse. Undertakers ran out of coffins, hospitals ran out of beds, mortuaries ran out of space and had to stack bodies in corridors. Florists sold out of flowers for funerals. And through it all, for 5 days, the government said and did almost nothing. There was no official warning to stay indoors. No advice to vulnerable populations. No emergency measures to reduce emissions. No public announcement of danger. The official position was that this was just a particularly bad fog, unpleasant but not dangerous. Britain had weathered worse. This too shall pass. Albert Shaw, a taxi driver from Bermondsey, tried to drive his pregnant wife to the hospital when her labor started on December 7th. He couldn't see beyond his windscreen. He got out, tried to walk beside the car, guiding it inch by inch. It took 3 hours to travel 2 miles. By the time they arrived, his wife was in distress. The baby was born blue, struggling for oxygen. The child survived, but hundreds of babies born during those 5 days didn't. Their first breath was poison. On December 9th, the weather finally changed. A wind picked up, the temperature inversion broke, and within hours the smog began to disperse. London emerged, blinking into weak winter sunlight. People stepped outside, took deep breaths of relatively clean air, and tried to convince themselves it was over. They went back to work, back to normal life, back to burning coal, because what else could they do? In hospitals, people kept dying. The smog had weakened thousands, left them vulnerable to infections their bodies could no longer fight. Through December and into January, the death toll kept rising. Pneumonia, heart failure, respiratory collapse. The fog was gone, but its victims kept falling. The initial estimates were shocking. In the week of the smog, deaths in London spiked to over 4,000 above the normal rate. But as the weeks passed, it became clear the true toll was far higher. Modern analysis of death records suggests that the Great Smog killed approximately 12,000 people. Some estimates go as high as 13,000. To put this in perspective, this was more British civilians than died in the worst bombing raids during the Blitz. This was more deaths than the cholera outbreak of 1854 that had revolutionized epidemiology. This was one of the deadliest environmental disasters in recorded history, and it happened not in the distant past. Not in some developing nation, but in the capital of one of the world's most advanced countries, in living memory. And here's what makes this truly terrifying. The British government denied all of it. For months afterward, the official position was that the smog had killed no one. The Minister of Health, Ian MacLeod, stood in Parliament and declared that the deaths were within normal seasonal variation. Perhaps a flu outbreak, perhaps the cold weather. It's nothing to do with air quality, nothing to do with pollution, certainly nothing to do with government policy. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the great wartime leader who had rallied Britain against the Nazis, was silent. The man who had promised blood, toil, tears, and sweat in the face of existential threat seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge this domestic disaster. Some historians suggest Churchill, a lifelong romantic about Britain's industrial past, deeply invested in coal production, simply couldn't accept that progress had become poison. But silence couldn't hold back the mounting evidence. Doctors began publishing studies showing the undeniable correlation between the smog and the death spike. Dr. Ernest Wilkins at the Ministry of Health's own statistical division produced data showing deaths from bronchitis had increased by 900% during the smog week. Heart disease deaths tripled. Respiratory disease deaths increased tenfold. The numbers were irrefutable. The cover-up was crumbling. Public pressure began to build. Newspapers, initially complicit in downplaying the disaster, began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why had nothing been done? Why were there no pollution controls? Why was Britain exporting clean coal while forcing its citizens to burn toxic sludge? Ordinary Londoners who had lost family members, friends, neighbors, children, demanded answers. The government, facing an increasingly angry public, finally conceded to an inquiry. The Committee on Air Pollution, chaired by Sir Hugh Beaver, was established in 1953 to investigate the causes of the smog and recommend solutions. The committee's work was thorough, collecting evidence from meteorologists, doctors, industrial experts, and survivors. Their report, published in 1954, was damning. The Beaver Report confirmed what many had suspected but the government had denied. The Great Smog was entirely man-made, caused by the burning of coal in conditions that trapped the pollution at ground level. The report estimated that during the smog, sulfur dioxide concentrations reached levels 7 times higher than normal, and particulate matter levels were catastrophically elevated. The report called for immediate action to reduce air pollution, including creating smoke-free zones in cities, regulating industrial emissions, and promoting cleaner fuels. But reports don't change societies overnight. The Beaver Report faced immediate opposition from powerful interests. The coal industry, one of Britain's largest employers and a cornerstone of national identity, fought against regulations. The National Coal Board argued that restrictions would devastate mining communities already struggling with post-war economic difficulties. Factory owners claimed that pollution controls would destroy their competitiveness against foreign manufacturers who faced no such restrictions. Even ordinary citizens resisted change. Coal fires were a deeply ingrained part of British life. The hearth was the heart of the home. The warm glow of burning coal was comfort, safety, tradition. Asking people to give up their coal fires felt like asking them to give up something fundamentally British. Gas and electric heating were expensive, unfamiliar, and viewed with suspicion. It would take years of political wrangling, lobbying, and public pressure, but eventually, the weight of evidence and the memory of 12,000 dead became irresistible. In 1956, 4 years after the Great Smog, Parliament passed the Clean Air Act, one of the first comprehensive pieces of environmental legislation in the world. This law would transform Britain, but the question remained, why did 12,000 people have to die before anyone acted? The Clean Air Act was revolutionary for its time. It established smoke control areas in cities where only smokeless fuels could be burned. It regulated industrial emissions, requiring factories to use taller chimneys to disperse pollution and install basic filtration systems. It provided grants to homeowners to convert from coal fires to gas or electric heating. And crucially, it gave local authorities the power to enforce these regulations with fines and prosecutions. The implementation was gradual. Can't convert an entire city's heating system overnight. But slowly, steadily, London began to change. The great coal fires that had burned in millions of homes for centuries began to go out, one by one, replaced by gas heaters and electric radiators. Factories installed scrubbers and filters. Power stations were relocated away from city centers or upgraded with pollution controls. The impact was dramatic. Within a decade, air quality in London had improved measurably. The frequency and intensity of smogs decreased year by year. The famous London fogs, once a defining characteristic of the city, romanticized in literature and film, became rarer and rarer. By the 1970s, they had virtually disappeared. The Thames, which had been declared biologically dead in the 1950s from pollution, began to recover. Fish returned. Birds nested on the riverbanks. The health impacts were equally striking. Death rates from respiratory diseases plummeted. Life expectancy increased. The chronic bronchitis that had been endemic in industrial cities, that distinctive coal miner's cough that affected millions, became less common. Londoners, many of whom had lived their entire lives breathing polluted air, experienced clean air for the first time and realized what they had been missing. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Great Smog and the Clean Air Act was ideological. It fundamentally changed how society thought about pollution and progress. Before 1952, pollution was accepted as inevitable, even desirable. Smoke meant industry. Industry meant jobs. Jobs meant prosperity. Pollution was the smell of money, the sign of a nation on the rise. After 1952, this equation was broken. Pollution became something to be controlled, regulated, eventually eliminated. The environment became recognized as a public good that governments had a duty to protect, not just an infinite resource to be exploited. Citizens had a right to clean air, clean water, a livable environment. This was a profound shift in thinking that would echo far beyond Britain's shores. Standing in modern London today, breathing air that is cleaner than it has been in over 2 centuries. Watching the Thames teeming with life, it's easy to think the lesson of the Great Smog has been learned. The transformation seems complete. The problem seems solved. But that complacency is dangerous. Because while London has cleaned its air, the problem hasn't gone away, it's just moved. The pollution that once choked London now chokes Delhi, Beijing, Lagos, Jakarta, Bangkok. An estimated 7 million people die every year from air pollution globally. Let that number sink in. 7 million. Every single year. That's more than 1,300 Great Smogs. Every year, the disaster hasn't ended. It's just been exported to the developing world, to places where economic growth is prioritized over environmental protection, where the same calculus that killed 12,000 Londoners is still considered acceptable. The lesson of the Great Smog is that we can't see the disaster until it's killing us, and sometimes not even then. In 1952, Londoners had lived with terrible air quality for so long, they didn't realize it was abnormal. It took a catastrophic spike in deaths, a fog so thick you couldn't see your hand, to make visible what had been invisible. How many people are dying today from pollution levels we've normalized and accepted as the price of progress? Climate change represents the ultimate extension of the logic that created the Great Smog. For over a century, humanity has been burning fossil fuels, pouring carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, treating the sky as an infinite dumping ground just as Londoners treated their air in 1952. The pollution is invisible. The impacts are delayed. The temptation to prioritize short-term economic activity over long-term environmental protection is overwhelming. The Great Smog of London killed 12,000 people in 5 days. It was a preventable tragedy born of negligence, denial, and the worship of industrial progress at any cost. But those 12,000 deaths were not in vain if we learn the lesson they taught. The air can kill. The environment has limits. Waiting until disaster strikes before we act means we've already failed. The test of civilization is not how we thrive in times of plenty, but how we respond when the invisible enemy arrives. In 1952, London failed that test. 12,000 people died before the government admitted there was even a problem. 4 more years passed before any action was taken. By then, the damage was done. The dead could not be brought back. The lesson was written in coffins. The fog has lifted from London's streets, but the question it posed still hangs in the air we all breathe. Are we willing to act on knowledge rather than catastrophe? Are we willing to change course before we hit the rocks? Or will we wait, as London did, until we can no longer see our hands in front of our faces, until our hospitals overflow, until our morgues run out of space? The Great Smog is not ancient history. It's a warning that keeps trying to be heard. The question is whether we're finally ready to listen, or whether we'll choke on our own denial until it's too late.